It took just 24 seconds for a silent African leader to turn the U.S. Congress into absolute silence. When Ibrahim Traoré opened that secret file, a man who once laughed at him on national TV lost everything. But what was inside the dossier? And why did no one stop it sooner? The heat in Ouagadougou was relentless that afternoon, but inside the modest sun-drenched presidential office, it wasn't the weather that tightened jaws and narrowed eyes. It was the voice echoing through the speakers. On a mounted screen in the corner of the room, the U.S. Senate hearing played live. American flags framed the room, microphones glinted under studio lights, and at the center of it all stood Senator J.D. Vance, clean-cut, confident, and grinning like he owned the moment. "And it's time we stop pretending that third-world strongmen deserve a seat at our table," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. "Let's be clear, foreign leaders who barely uphold human rights in their own dirt-poor nations should not be dictating how we, the United States of America, do business, especially not in Africa." A soft click echoed in the room as Ibrahim Traoré leaned forward and paused the video. The screen froze on Vance's smirk, frozen but still repugnant. The silence in the room was thick. He did not raise his voice. He didn't slam his hand down in fury. Instead, Ibrahim Traoré just stared. His eyes dark, sharp, weary with years of war and negotiation, didn't blink. But they burned. Across the room, Aminata, his top aide, stood frozen with a tablet in hand. "It's trending," she said cautiously, as if breaking the silence would shatter glass. "Send them back." Savage leaders. Even some senators are retweeting it. She hesitated. "It's getting ugly." Ibrahim leaned back slowly in his chair. Outside the open window, the call to prayer echoed across the city. A moment of peace tainted now by the venom dripping from the mouth of an American senator thousands of miles away, yet somehow reaching into the very walls of this office. "You know," Ibrahim said, voice low, "when they invade your land, they bring tanks. But when they invade your dignity, they bring microphones." Aminata said nothing. The camera feed was still paused, Vance's face stuck mid-sentence, like a ghost daring him to react. The man had made a career out of weaponizing poverty, first his own, then that of others. But this was different. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso. This was about every African leader who'd ever been reduced to a caricature. About every brown-skinned diplomat who'd been talked over in global meetings. About every village that had been stripped bare while Western officials smiled and shook hands for the cameras. And for the first time in years, Ibrahim felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since he took office. Rage. "You remember that land dispute last year?" Aminata asked, carefully snapping him from his thoughts. "The one near the Niger border? The mining firm." "Yes, they were tied to an American holding company, which happens to be one of J.D. Vance's biggest donors." Ibrahim's gaze shifted. "Are you sure I pulled the filings myself? Offshore accounts? Shell companies?" "It's not just political rhetoric. He's protecting something, or someone." A silence stretched between them, and then softly Ibrahim chuckled. But there was no joy in it. "They always want us silent," he said, "until they can blame us for being quiet." He pressed play again. The idea that someone like Ibrahim Traoré, a man with a military past, limited democratic legitimacy, and zero experience in Western diplomacy, should be lecturing this Congress on corporate ethics is not only laughable, it's insulting. That was the sentence, the one that changed everything. Ibrahim stood up slowly and walked to the window. He stared out at the red dust roads and the distant hum of a people who'd endured centuries of being spoken for, spoken over, and spoken down to. "That's enough," he whispered. Not to Aminata, not to the room, to history. What he didn't know not yet was that within 72 hours, a sealed envelope would arrive on his desk, postmarked from Virginia, with no return address. Inside it, a file. Thick, stamped confidential, marked only with the initials JDV. What was in that envelope? Why had someone risked everything to send it? And how far was Ibrahim willing to go, not just for himself, but for justice, long overdue? This wasn't just a broadcast anymore. It was a declaration of war. And Ibrahim Traoré had just chosen to answer it. The envelope arrived with no fanfare, no signature, no stamps of urgency or ceremony. Just a worn manila packet slipped beneath the carved teakwood door of the presidential residence in Ouagadougou, a place guarded day and night by men with rifles and instincts sharper than steel. Aminata found it first. At first glance, it looked like another diplomatic memo or budget document. But something felt off. It had no markings from any department, no official seal. The handwriting, a tight, nervous scrawl, read only, "For President Traoré's eyes only. Confidential. Do not copy, do not photograph." Ibrahim opened it with a letter opener shaped like a ceremonial dagger, an old gift from a village elder. Inside was a single folded letter and a USB drive taped to the back of the page. The letterhead was unmistakable: Dominion Ridge Resource Corporation, headquartered in Houston, Texas. A logo of a golden eagle perched atop crossed mining axes. His brow furrowed as he began to read. The first few lines were cordial. A typical internal memo from an executive to a U.S. senator. But by paragraph 3, the tone shifted, and so did Ibrahim's breathing. "We're grateful for your continued protection of DRRC's expansion into the Sahel corridor. Your influence within the Committee on Foreign Investment has been instrumental in preventing regulatory interference." He paused. The Sahel corridor was home to some of the most fragile ecosystems in West Africa, and more importantly, to dozens of villages recently displaced by resource rezoning efforts. Publicly, these had been blamed on regional instability. But here in black and white was an admission someone had been clearing land for profit, with political cover from Washington. Ibrahim flipped the letter over. Scribbled at the bottom, barely legible, was a line added in pen. "They never expected this would reach you. Be careful who you trust." He stared at it for a long time. The paper trembled faintly in his hand. Aminata leaned in. "Sir," he handed her the USB. "Check what's on this. In private, no internal network, no cloud." 20 minutes later, she returned. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "There are emails," she whispered. "Hundreds, memos, meeting transcripts, offshore payments." J.D. Vance wasn't just aware he approved the timeline for the evictions. He was copied on every milestone. Ibrahim exhaled sharply. "Any media?" She nodded. "One video." She turned the laptop around. The screen lit up a grainy handheld recording taken from what looked like the corner of a boardroom. A group of executives laughed around a long polished table, and there at the end, unmistakable, sat J.D. Vance. "Africa's untapped land is our future," he was saying, glass in hand. "We either help ourselves to it or China will. And trust me, the villagers will move. They always do, especially when we move first." The room erupted in laughter. Ibrahim shut the lid. This wasn't just racism anymore. This was calculated exploitation. This was policy as theft, the monetization of suffering behind diplomatic smiles. And now, for the first time, there was evidence. Actionable, undeniable, dangerous. He looked out the window. The sun had dipped low, casting the city in molten gold. But inside his chest, it felt like midnight. He sat back in his chair and looked at the letter again. One sentence echoed louder than all the rest. "Be careful who you trust." The implications gnawed at him. If this letter was real, and it certainly seemed to be then, someone inside the very mechanisms of power had turned. But why send it now? And who? A whistleblower? A spurned ally? Or something more complex, a warning disguised as a gift? Aminata broke the silence. "What do we do, Mr. President?" Ibrahim didn't answer immediately. Instead, he folded the letter slowly, precisely, as if sealing something ancient. His eyes, tired but fierce, didn't blink. "We go to war," he said. "With America?" she asked. He shook his head. "With silence. Some truths aren't meant to be uncovered. But once they are, the world never returns to how it was." The clock in Ibrahim's study ticked with a soft, stubborn rhythm, as if deliberately counting down something more than time. Midnight had passed, but the president of Burkina Faso remained seated in the same high-backed chair, motionless, eyes fixed on the flame of the antique oil lamp that flickered in the corner. The rest of the palace slept, but in this room shadows refused to rest. The classified letter sat neatly on the desk before him, beside a thick folder of digital printouts and a closed laptop containing the damning video. A single file, 100 pages, and the weight of 100 years. His fingers traced the grain of the desk, hand-carved mahogany from a forest that no longer existed, like the villages that had vanished under corporate bulldozers. Like the voices J.D. Vance had mocked, buried beneath polite words and profit charts. It wasn't just about the insult anymore. Not even about Vance himself. It was about all the meetings where African leaders were spoken over, all the trade deals where resources flowed one way and promises the other. It was about being seen as a man with a gun and not a mind. About dignity trampled not by tanks but by shareholders. And so he sat between silence and storm. Diplomacy whispered caution in his ear. Retaliation begged for thunder. He reached for the old rotary phone in the corner. It hadn't rung in years, not for official matters. But tonight it wouldn't ring. Tonight it would roar. He dialed slowly. Not a number in West Africa, not in Europe, but a secure line routed through Geneva. A woman's voice answered on the fourth ring. Marianne Leclerc, International Law Group. This is Ibrahim Traoré, he said calmly. Silence. Then a shift in tone, immediate respectful alert. Yes, Mr. President, I need a legal team, he said. Independent, international, unafraid. What's the case? Corporate conspiracy, political interference, human displacement, racketeering. A U.S. senator's involved. There was a pause, long calculating. And the damages you're seeking? He stared at the letter one last time, then pushed it gently aside. $100 million. Another silence. Then we'll begin at once. He hung up without saying goodbye. The window beside him had begun to fog with the cool breath of night. Beyond it, the city lay quiet, unaware. But somewhere across the ocean, a man named J.D. Vance was sleeping peacefully, unaware that his smile at the Senate hearing would soon be carved into infamy. Ibrahim stood slowly, straightened his jacket, and whispered not to the room but to history. Let the world know what they did to us. The flame in the corner flickered once and burned steady. Before the dossier, before the lawsuit, before the moment Congress fell silent, there were two men born continents apart, raised under different skies, molded by storms of different natures, walking separate paths toward power, yet destined to collide. J.D. Vance had once been the darling of American bootstrap mythology. The son of a troubled household in Middletown, Ohio, he rose from poverty with a Harvard law degree tucked under one arm and a best-selling memoir under the other. Hillbilly Elegy. They called it a raw confession wrapped in patriotism, detailing the broken culture of America's forgotten white working class. It was a perfect story for the media, gritty, redemptive, marketable, a man who had suffered and then understood America. But what the cameras never showed was the boardroom. While the public focused on the man who ate boxed macaroni in childhood, they missed the man who dined with lobbyists in adulthood. J.D. Vance's rise was not just built on grit, it was buoyed by billionaires. Peter Thiel's money seeded his campaign. Energy conglomerates shaped his talking points. Multinational corporations wrote his positions on foreign affairs, many of which aligned suspiciously well with resource extraction and deregulation. He wore populism like a flag, but he legislated like a shareholder. His speeches were peppered with mentions of working-class America, but his campaign disclosures told a quieter truth, millions of dollars tied to mining oil and defense. When asked about Africa, he scoffed, "It's not our backyard." When pressed on foreign exploitation, he dismissed it as woke guilt. And yet his image endured. J.D. Vance, the scrappy patriot. Clean-cut, decisive, unapologetically American. Half a world away, another man was rising with no memoir, no wealthy donors, and no televised redemption arc. Ibrahim Traoré was born into a Burkina Faso under siege by civil unrest, military coups, and ghosts of colonizers who had left but never truly gone. He didn't write about suffering. He lived it. At 13, he'd watched his uncle disappear during a protest. At 16, he enlisted. By 25, he was leading anti-corruption raids inside the very military that once silenced his village. There were no book deals, no camera crews, just mud, blood, and conviction. While Vance held town halls with consultants, Ibrahim held field tribunals for warlords. Where Vance shook hands at fundraisers, Ibrahim intercepted bribes in shipping containers. And when he finally entered politics, reluctantly pushed by elders and soldiers alike, he did so with one promise: to unlearn the script written by foreign hands. He didn't speak in sound bites. He spoke in silences, measured words, and uncomfortable truths. At summits, he was often the least photographed, but the most remembered. When others recited press releases, he recounted names of villages that had disappeared under mining deals approved in distant capitals. To some, he was a threat. To others, a reformer. But to all, he was real. Two men, two origins. One molded by privilege disguised as pain, the other forged in fire and made to carry his people with him. They would have never crossed paths, not in this lifetime, had it not been for a single memo hidden behind polished smiles and quarterly profits. A letter that revealed how one man backed by empire saw Africa not as a continent, but as collateral. And another standing on sun-scorched soil decided it was time to answer. Not with anger, not with vengeance, but with truth. The kind of truth that doesn't go viral. It goes viral proof it burns, it spreads, and it never unsees. The conference room at the International Law Group's Dakar office was dimly lit, its windows shielded from the harsh West African sun. On the polished glass table, rows of documents were neatly arranged emails, financial ledgers, project blueprints, and internal memos. All of them freshly decrypted, freshly damning. Ibrahim sat at the head of the table, flanked by two senior lawyers in Aminata. His face, as usual, was unreadable, not cold, but controlled. But behind his stillness, something in the air had shifted. The room knew it. Marianne Leclerc, lead counsel from Geneva, tapped a single folder. "This is where it begins," she said. Dominion Ridge Mining, Commoner DRMC for short, registered in Delaware, operates in Nigeria, Mali, and as we discovered, across 5 hidden sites in Burkina Faso. 3 of them inside conflict zones where displacement is illegal under international law. She slid the folder toward Ibrahim. "These are internal communications from their project directors to U.S. intermediaries." All of them referenced J.D. Vance indirectly at first, then by name. Ibrahim opened the folder slowly. Inside was a printed email chain dated 15 months earlier. The subject line, Sahel clearance. Green light. His eyes moved line by line. "Senator Vance has confirmed no diplomatic interference expected. The corridor's clear. Will expedite relocation by Q3. Incentives to military partners have been issued. Rebranding the operation under Humanitarian Aid Initiative per recommendation." He stopped. "Incentives to military partners," he murmured. "They paid off local commanders." Aminata nodded grimly. "That's how the villages vanished without a trace. No press, no paperwork, just silence." Marianne continued, voice steady but quiet. "There's more. On the USB, we found satellite overlays from DRMC's own records. They marked non-compliant zones in red. Those were actual villages, populated, functioning, some with schools, health posts." She pulled out another folder and laid down a high-resolution satellite map. Red dots clustered along a stretch of arid land right along the country's northwest border. "We cross-referenced them with pre-conflict census maps," she added. "These were real communities. They existed. And now, nothing." Ibrahim leaned in, his finger traced along the red zones. "Read me the names," he said. Marianne hesitated. "Please," he repeated. She cleared her throat. "Sorkudugu, Bina, Kaule, Feremo, Kulbo." Her voice trailed off as Ibrahim raised a hand. He closed his eyes. "Feremo," he said softly. "My cousin's wife was from Feremo. She used to braid hair for the women every Sunday morning after church." No one spoke. A heaviness settled into the room, not of strategy or legal urgency, but of something far more ancient. Loss. "This isn't just extraction," Ibrahim said after a long silence. "This is erasure. You can rebuild homes. But who rebuilds memory? Who redraws names that are no longer on maps?" Marianne placed another document in front of him, a signed directive from DRMC's Africa Operations Manager. Confirmed. Phase 4 clearance executed. Sites sterilized. Cartographic update submitted to GIS division. "Sterilized," Aminata whispered. "That's how they describe it." Ibrahim exhaled slowly. The language was clinical, efficient, and inhuman. Behind those words were elders, children, entire oral histories, buried under dust and corporate ambition. He gathered the papers into a single pile. "Begin compiling it for court," he said. "All of it, every memo, every signature, every vanished village. And the satellite images," Marianne asked. "Print them, full scale. I want the judge to see Not just the evidence, but the silence they created. He stood up, the chair creaking behind him. They thought no one would notice, but we did. And now so will the world. The courtyard of the presidential press office in Ouagadougou was unusually quiet. No crowds, no fanfare, no podium. Just a wooden bench, two guards at the gate, and a single folded statement sealed in a brown envelope marked for immediate release. Ibrahim did not want a grand press conference. Not yet. He didn't want cameras flashing or microphones jostling for position. He wanted something quieter, sharper, a whisper with the power to shake walls. The envelope was delivered by hand to four carefully selected journalists, one from France, one from South Africa, one from Al Jazeera, and one from The Guardian. No Americans, not yet. The goal wasn't confrontation, it was planting a seed. The statement itself was brief, no more than 4 paragraphs, but every word had been honed, revised, and sharpened like a blade. We have uncovered substantial evidence of coordinated displacement, land theft, and collusion between a sitting U.S. senator and a multinational resource firm operating in West Africa. The findings include signed documents, satellite evidence, and internal communication linking Senator J.D. Vance to illegal extraction activities in Burkina Faso. This is not an accusation. It is a warning to those who believe silence is protection and power is immunity. We are preparing legal action. The world will soon know. It was signed simply President Ibrahim Traoré. Within hours, the statement made its rounds in European and African news cycles. But in the U.S., the reaction was muted. CNN ran a 20-second segment buried in international coverage. Fox News dismissed it as foreign political theater. J.D. Vance's office issued a one-line reply, completely baseless and beneath comment. The story seemed to stall until the hashtags began to appear. Dossier Africa. Justice for Frelimo. Who owns Africa? At first, it was the diaspora. Young African activists in London and New York, digital artists in Nairobi, college students in Johannesburg. They began posting redacted screenshots from the leaked memo overlays of satellite maps and a grainy still frame of Vance at the Dominion Ridge boardroom table. Within 24 hours, the hashtags trended in 5 countries. Within 48, journalists began digging. Vice News found a matching land contract between DRMC and a shell company registered under Vance's former advisor. A TikTok creator with over 2 million followers posted a 60-second expose that amassed 12 million views in a day. Even Reddit lit up J.D. Vance tied to African land theft. What is happening? Suddenly, what had begun as a quiet press release on a dusty bench in Ouagadougou became a wildfire of speculation, outrage, and momentum. Inside, the West Wing briefings included Ibrahim's name for the first time. In Ohio, Vance's communications team scrambled to prepare talking points. And in the heart of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim stood on the balcony of his residence, watching the sky turn from copper to dusk, knowing the storm had begun. Not with a headline, not with a speech, but with a seed buried in truth, watered by outrage, and now growing in the minds of millions. He turned to Aminata and said, "They won't ignore us for long." It started not with a journalist, but with a poet. 22-year-old Mariam Diarra, a spoken word artist from Bamako, posted a grainy, unfiltered video to her Instagram story. In it, she stared into the lens with unblinking eyes and recited words like a knife pressed to the conscience. "You stole our gold, our diamonds, our names, but now you steal our homes and call it opportunity." She ended it simply, "Chucker justice for Africa." That single post, barely a minute long, was shared over 500,000 times in 24 hours. By the time major networks noticed the buzz, the movement had already outpaced them. It spread like wildfire from Nairobi to Atlanta, from Johannesburg to Toronto, from Accra to Paris, across TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Not as a centralized campaign, but as an uprising of memory and rage. The face of Ibrahim Traoré, once reserved for niche policy circles, now looped in vertical videos beside hashtags like "Nanyar Africa deserves," "Better," and "Dismantle Empire." But more powerful than his face were the faces of those he had spoken for: the villagers, the mothers, the children. One of the first to go viral was a survivor named Odette. Her interview was filmed by a Ghanaian journalist in a refugee camp near the Burkina Mali border. She wore a faded blue scarf and her voice trembled as she spoke. They came with trucks, no warning, just dust. And then the fire. My husband tried to ask questions. They shot near his feet. We ran. I don't know where my son is. The clip hit 7 million views in 48 hours. Another, a middle-aged teacher from the village of Kulbo, sat beneath a tree and explained how their school had been demolished overnight. They said we had no papers, that the land belonged to the future now. But who decides we don't exist anymore? The power of these stories wasn't in their production value, it was in their authenticity. Shaky cameras, real tears, names and places that just a week earlier had never been uttered in Western media. American college campuses took up the chant. At Howard University, students staged a digital sit-in, flooding J.D. Vance's Senate email with links to the evidence. In Paris, youth groups projected satellite images of the red zones onto the side of the Eiffel Tower at night. A massive projection lit up one word: erased. In Sao Paulo, graffiti artists painted murals of Frimo's name across underpasses. In Berlin, an open letter signed by over 200 scholars of post-colonial studies demanded an investigation into U.S. corporate activity in the Sahel. And through it all, one name kept returning: Traoré. Not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a symbol of something long overdue: resistance with receipts. His team didn't issue statements. They didn't try to steer the narrative. They didn't have to. The people had taken the story into their own hands. What had once been dismissed as a foreign press stunt was now a cultural reckoning. No longer was this about J.D. Vance's reputation. It was about a system, a legacy, a long, blood-stained ledger. And slowly the U.S. media began to crack. MSNBC invited a human rights expert to speak. NPR ran a feature titled "The Villages That Disappeared." Even conservative outlets started to cover it, if only to spin or deny. But the most telling moment came during a CNN roundtable when a senator trying to defend J.D. Vance made the mistake of calling Frimo a disputed site. A journalist across the table held up a printed photo of a Frimo woman clutching a school book beneath a tent. "She doesn't look disputed," the journalist said flatly. Back in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim watched from his residence as the television screen flickered with images he never thought would reach the world. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply turned to Aminata and said, "Now, they're listening." And across the globe, millions were not only listening, they were shouting. The flags behind him were perfectly positioned. The suit was crisp, the lighting deliberate. Senator J.D. Vance stepped up to the podium at the Russell Senate Office Building with a practiced air of calm authority, the kind that only men who have never truly been threatened can exude. He looked into the sea of cameras and leaned into the microphone. "I want to make one thing very clear," he began, his voice measured, confident. "This so-called lawsuit coming out of Burkina Faso is nothing more than political theater orchestrated by a foreign agitator seeking attention on the world stage." He paused. A slight smirk played at the corner of his lips, the same one Ibrahim had seen frozen on the Senate broadcast weeks earlier. Ibrahim Traoré is not a statesman. He is a military opportunist trying to leverage online outrage into global sympathy. And frankly, I won't dignify baseless conspiracy theories with further comment. The statement was short, direct, and carefully designed, not to clarify but to control the narrative. Minutes later, press releases echoed his words across every major conservative outlet. Fox News opened their 8 p.m. hour with a headline in bold red: "African strongman targets America's values." Pundits leaned in with mockery. Ibrahim, who one anchor, laughed. "These radicals see profit in playing the victim. This is just the latest example of woke globalists trying to shame the West for succeeding." Another nodded solemnly. "Let's be honest, this is about anti-Americanism. They hate that we lead." Across social media, hashtags that once championed justice were now met with coordinated backlash. Trshaka Traoré truth turned into Arka Traoré fraud. Far-right influencers mocked the movement, posting memes of bulldozers and gold bars. Political bots flooded forums questioning the authenticity of the leaked documents and sowing doubt in algorithm-fed comment sections. The denial machine had awakened, and it was working. For a moment, the fire seemed to flicker, until a man named Eli Whitaker stepped forward. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't even on social media. For the past 13 years, Whitaker had worked as a project manager in the Sahel division of Dominion Ridge Mining Company. Most people had never heard of him, and he liked it that way. But late one night, as the headlines spun and the world twisted toward dismissal, Whitaker sent an encrypted email to a journalist at ProPublica. The subject line was simple: "It's true, I was there." By the next morning, he was sitting under the hum of fluorescent lights in a hotel room just outside Baltimore. Face blurred, voice altered, but words crystal clear. "I saw the emails. I was in the meetings," Whitaker said in the exclusive interview. Senator Vance wasn't just informed, he was actively involved. "He met with Dominion Ridge executives twice that I know of. He approved funding flows. He even pushed to rebrand the eviction process as development partnerships." He paused. "I remember one meeting where someone joked, 'They won't even know they're gone.'" And Vance laughed. The footage spread like gasoline meeting flame. News outlets that had stayed silent now scrambled to verify. CNN requested the original documents. The Guardian confirmed the geotags in Whitaker's photos matched known DRMC sites. MSNBC booked a segment titled "The Whistleblower Who Changed the Narrative." Public trust, once teetering, now cracked open. Even on Fox, a guest analyst, a former Army intelligence officer, admitted, "If what this man says holds up, there will be consequences. Serious ones." In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim sat across from Aminata in the early morning light as the clip of Whitaker's voice played on her tablet. "He's risking everything," she said. "He's telling the truth," Ibrahim replied. "That's always a risk." Outside the window, a soft wind stirred the trees, quiet but resolute. The denial machine had roared, spun, twisted, but the truth now spoken from within had pierced straight through it. The words "ethics review" sounded mild, almost harmless, bureaucratic in tone, toothless in implication. But on Capitol Hill, even the softest whispers can echo like thunder if heard at the right moment. Under growing public pressure and a media storm fueled by Eli Whitaker's revelations, the Senate Ethics Committee announced a preliminary inquiry into Senator J.D. Vance's ties to Dominion Ridge Mining Co. It wasn't a trial, not yet, but it was the first official crack in the polished veneer of invulnerability Vance had long wrapped himself in. Behind the scenes, aides scrambled. Calls were made. Talking points were revised, then scrapped. Meanwhile, Vance kept his schedule light and his statements lighter, insisting he would cooperate fully with what he called a routine political distraction. But the country was watching, and so was the world. 3 days later, a quiet motorcade pulled into a side entrance at Dulles International Airport. No press, no official welcoming committee, just a black sedan and a single security vehicle. But that changed the moment they entered Washington, D.C. As Ibrahim Traoré's convoy rolled through the streets of the capital, it passed dozens of protesters lining the sidewalks, a patchwork of students, activists, human rights lawyers, and African diaspora groups. Some held banners with hashtags, "Chocchern Justice for Farimo," "Donanasher Vance Exposed." Others raised hand-painted signs with a message that had begun to spread across the globe: "Justice has no borders." Ibrahim, seated in the back seat, said nothing, but he watched every face, every hand raised, every chant echoing against the glass. He had not come to perform. He had come to be present, to let them see what had been erased, to remind those inside the marbled halls that the world was no longer looking away. Inside the Hart Senate office building, the hearing chamber was deliberately modest, wood-paneled, lit with a muted palette that suggested civility over spectacle. But the cameras told a different story. Every news network had sent crews. The front row was filled with congressional staffers pretending not to text updates in real time. Ibrahim sat in silence near the back, flanked by his legal counsel and Aminata. He wore no medals, no traditional robes, just a dark suit, a calm expression, and the kind of posture that told everyone in the room, "I did not come here for your approval." When J.D. Vance entered minutes later through a side door, there was a flicker of tension, the kind of brief, unspoken recognition between two men who had never met but had already become symbols of opposing worlds. Vance did not look at Ibrahim, not directly, but his eyes scanned just enough to acknowledge the presence and the pressure. The committee chair called the session to order. What followed was procedural, a review of submitted materials, an outline of investigative scope, and a public assurance of objectivity and transparency. But beneath it all, a current was moving. This was no longer about policy. This was personal, moral, global. As the session adjourned, a reporter shouted toward Ibrahim, "Do you believe justice is possible in this room?" He paused, turned slightly, and offered a simple reply. "Justice doesn't live in rooms," he said. "It lives in people." And with that, he walked out, leaving the walls to tremble on their own. The courtroom was colder than expected. Not in temperature, but in tone, sterile, deliberate, and unnervingly quiet, as if the walls themselves had signed a non-disclosure agreement. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows high above the chamber, casting long diagonal shadows across the polished floor. The room was packed, every seat filled with journalists, policy aides, camera crews, legal observers. The hum of soft conversations barely covered the click of pens and the quiet focus of thousands watching remotely. At the front sat the federal judge, a silver-haired woman, known for her no-nonsense demeanor and intolerance for political spectacle. She eyed the room with quiet command before clearing her throat and calling the hearing to order. "Let's proceed with opening statements," she said. The lead attorney for J.D. Vance's defense rose, first a man named Mitchell Crane, polished to the point of gleam with a voice built for microphones and fundraisers. He adjusted his cufflinks, took a strategic breath, and turned to face the jury with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today, you are going to hear stories. Emotional stories. Carefully selected narratives designed to make you feel sympathy, guilt, maybe even shame. But I urge you to remember, this is not a court of emotion. It is a court of law." He walked slowly across the front of the jury box. "What my client is being accused of is nothing short of fantastical. A United States senator allegedly colluding with mining companies to secretly displace entire African communities, all while navigating the complexities of foreign policy, corporate law, and local governments thousands of miles away." He paused for effect. "This isn't a trial, it's a performance. And my client is simply the latest villain cast in a global drama where facts take a back seat to feelings." A few jurors shifted in their seats. One or two nodded slightly. Crane smirked and returned to his chair. Then came the quiet footsteps of a younger, smaller figure. Elise Ford, barely in her 30s, hair pulled into a tight bun, her navy blue suit crisp but modest. No theatrics needed. She stepped into the center of the courtroom like she had walked into a room she already knew by heart. She paused, looked at the jury, let the silence breathe. "My name is Elise Ford," she said, her voice low and steady. "And I represent not just President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. I represent something more uncomfortable." She held up a single photograph, a child in a tattered school uniform standing barefoot in a field of rubble where a village once stood. "This girl's name is Yama. She used to walk 2 miles to school every day. Now that school no longer exists, not because of war, not because of natural disaster, but because somewhere in a glass-walled boardroom a decision was made that her education and her home were less valuable than the minerals beneath her feet." She placed the photo on the evidence table. "This isn't a story. This is evidence. We have internal memos, satellite records, sworn testimonies, and financial trails that will prove, not suggest, prove that Senator Vance facilitated, shielded, and profited from corporate actions that directly violated both international law and human dignity." She turned toward the judge now. "We are not here to put America on trial. We are here to remind it who it claims to be." And then once more to the jury, I ask only this: listen, not just to the arguments, but to the silence. The silence where villages once stood. The silence where names have been erased. The silence where justice has not yet been heard. No one moved as she returned to her seat. Even Crane had stopped smiling. The first witness took the stand just after noon. Her name was Adama Sangare, a woman in her mid-50s dressed in a simple cotton wrap, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not speak English, so every word she uttered in her native Moor was translated through a court interpreter. But even through layers of language and legal formality, the emotion came through raw, vivid, undeniable. She spoke of the morning her village, Kaole, was emptied, of the jeeps that arrived before sunrise, of the loudspeakers blaring orders to evacuate, of the soldiers with unmarked uniforms who claimed the land now belonged to the future. Her voice quivered when she recounted how her brother refused to leave and was taken away. They never saw him again. We had a school, she said, a clinic, even a well that we dug with our own hands. They said it didn't matter, that the ground under us was more valuable than the lives on top of it. The courtroom was silent. One juror wiped their eye. The judge shifted slightly in her seat. On the defense bench, J.D. Vance sat motionless, jaw clenched, his lawyers, scribbling notes without looking up. Then came a second witness, Boubacar Ouedraogo, a former schoolteacher from Zurkudugu who had tried to organize peaceful resistance. He showed photos of where his classroom once stood. Now it was just dry red earth pitted with tire tracks and mining equipment. These were not evacuations, he said. They were erasures. But the room shifted from quiet heartbreak to electrified tension when the third witness took the stand. His name was Daniel Kerr. He wore a gray blazer and a red tie, but his face looked drained, the look of a man carrying something that had hollowed him from the inside out. He had worked for Dominion Ridge Mining Co. for 11 years, mostly in logistics and interdepartmental communication. 2 years ago, he left the company. No explanation. No farewell. Now under oath, his voice was steady but heavy. I was responsible for compiling internal clearance schedules and coordinating our Sahel project teams, he began. And yes, Senator J.D. Vance was not only aware of the operations in Burkina Faso, he was directly involved. A murmur rolled through the room. Elise Ford stood. Mr. Kerr, for the record, are you testifying that a sitting United States Senator authorized the strategic displacement of villages for corporate gain? Yes, Kerr said. He approved everything. He paused. In one meeting, I remember someone asking if we needed more local government clearance. Vance said, if they've got a problem, I'll fix it on my end. Just get the land cleared. He laughed afterward. So did everyone else, except me. He reached into his briefcase and produced a folder, copies of internal emails, contracts and scheduling memos, all entered into evidence. Senator Vance used diplomatic language in public, Kerr continued. But behind closed doors, he was a fixer, a facilitator. He knew exactly what we were doing, and he helped us do it faster. J.D. Vance's attorneys objected, tried to discredit, questioned Kerr's motive, but his tone never wavered. I stayed silent for too long, he said. But when I saw what was done to those people, when I saw the children sleeping in refugee camps so our shareholders could report higher quarterly earnings, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. The judge called for a short recess. As people filed out of the courtroom, the murmurs weren't just from press or pundits. They came from jurors, guards, court staff, all visibly shaken. In the hallway, a reporter whispered, "This just changed everything." And it had. When Ibrahim Traoré approached the witness stand, there was no shuffle of papers, no nod to the crowd. Just the soft thud of his shoes against the floor and the sound of 1,000 cameras clicking all at once. He raised his right hand, swore his oath, and took his seat with the quiet composure of a man who had seen revolutions, funerals, and flags torn down in the dust. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't need to. His eyes remained on the jury, not with challenge, but with the clarity of someone who had carried more than just a case into this room. Elise Ford stepped forward. "Mr. Traoré," she began gently, "we've heard testimony about land theft, corruption, and political damage. But we ask you now, not just as a president, but as a citizen. What else was lost?" Ibrahim's hands were folded loosely in front of him. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low, steady. "I was born in a village that no longer exists," he said. "The place I played as a child, the tree my mother used to tie her laundry to, the well my grandfather dug, all of it is gone. Not from war, not from nature, but from greed disguised as development." He paused, not for effect, but because some memories require breath to cross the throat. "I know this courtroom deals in evidence, signatures, footage, memos, but I am here to speak for what doesn't get documented." He leaned in slightly. "What is the value of a song no one sings anymore, because the women who sang it were scattered to refugee camps? What ledger holds the worth of a community meal that no longer happens because the cooking stones were bulldozed along with the village square? What document do you sign when you erase a story passed from father to son, not because of time, but because the land where that story was told is now guarded by men with rifles and clipboards?" The room was still. "I have led armies. I have survived coups. I have negotiated with presidents and rebels. But nothing has wounded me more than meeting a child named Fatih who asked why her school was punished. She didn't say destroyed, she said punished, as if education had done something wrong. His eyes moved to the defense table just for a moment, not accusing, but witnessing. I do not come here to seek revenge. I come to ask a question. Is it acceptable that our suffering becomes someone else's profit? And if not, what will you do with the truth you now carry? He fell silent. No cross-examination came, no objection, no scoffing. Even J.D. Vance didn't lift his head. Elise stepped forward once more, her voice quiet but clear. Your Honor, the plaintiff rests its case for today. She turned to the jury, locking eyes with them as if handing something over. This is not just about money, she said. It's about truth, and what we choose to do with it when we can no longer pretend we didn't know. The judge called for recess, but no one moved right away. The silence wasn't procedural. It was sacred. The attacks didn't begin in the courtroom. They began on television. Just 2 days after Ibrahim's powerful testimony shook the courtroom and sent headlines soaring, a very different kind of narrative began surfacing on late-night cable. On a popular conservative show, a smirking anchor leaned into the camera and asked, "Why is a foreign military leader testifying in a U.S. court about American business who invited this man to lecture us on morality?" The chyron below him read, "Ibrahim Traoré, truth teller or tribal tyrant." Within 48 hours, that tone echoed across an entire echo chamber. They said Ibrahim had ties to communist regimes. They suggested he fueled anti-American sentiment abroad. They played footage of him in military fatigues, stripped of context, layered over ominous music and vague references to African instability. And then, as if choreographed, came the personal attacks. Old photographs of Ibrahim with other African leaders were recirculated and falsely labeled as militia alliances. Fabricated quotes appeared on fringe blogs claiming he had once said the U.S. was the enemy of Africa. Despite multiple fact checks debunking those claims, they spread like gasoline on dry earth. But the fire didn't stop with him. It turned on Elise Ford next. First, there were the anonymous tweets, crude remarks about her hair, her voice, her clothes. Then someone leaked her undergraduate essays, twisting a decades-old paper about colonial reparations into a radical manifesto. She began receiving threatening emails. One message simply read, "You picked the wrong country to fight in." Her office door was defaced with spray paint. At her apartment, someone left a dead bird in a shoebox. But the most crushing blow came quietly. One of the major human rights organizations, funding travel and research for the case Global Equal Foundation, sent a polite but devastating letter. Due to recent political sensitivities and internal concerns from several board members, it read, "We must respectfully withdraw our support until further notice." When Elise shared the news with Ibrahim, her voice trembled for the first time. "We're losing ground," she said. "Not because of law, but fear." Ibrahim said nothing at first. He simply looked out the window of the temporary legal office they had converted in a townhouse off Massachusetts Avenue. Outside, the American flag waved steady, unfazed. "They do not fear me," he finally said. "They fear what I represent, that truth can come from the places they were taught to ignore." He turned to Elise. "They can spin, they can smear, but they cannot make this disappear. It's too late for that." Still, the stress was undeniable. News outlets began quietly downgrading their coverage. Sponsors of forums that once welcomed Elise were postponing events. Online forums flooded with conspiracies. Vance's approval ratings shockingly began to tick upward among his base. His campaign issued vague but effective press releases about foreign intimidation tactics and protecting American sovereignty. In public, Elise held strong, but behind closed doors, exhaustion crept into her voice. She slept at the office now, always with one eye on her inbox, the other on a growing folder labeled simply "Threat Reports." And yet the public wasn't entirely buying it. For every smear, there were counters. Young activists released montage videos of Vance's changing rhetoric over the years, calling out hypocrisy. African American leaders across churches and universities issued public letters of support for Ibrahim, condemning the racist undertones of the media narrative. Hashtags like "We Stand with Elise" and "We See You Vance" started to circulate. But in that moment, in the heart of the campaign's darkest chapter, it felt like a storm. A storm engineered not by facts, but by fear. Not by truth, but by volume. And the question that lingered in the air was not whether they would survive it. It was, would anyone still be listening when they emerged from it? The townhouse felt colder that night, not from the DC weather, but from the silence that had settled over everything. Ibrahim sat alone by the window, the room lit only by the soft hum of a desk lamp. Outside, the city pulsed with artificial light and distant sirens, but inside it was still, unmoving, the kind of quiet that feels like a verdict. His phone buzzed. He didn't check it. He had stopped reading the headlines 2 days ago, stopped counting how many news segments had painted him as a dictator, a disruptor, an outsider. What stung wasn't their words, but the growing silence from those who once stood beside him. Allies who had cheered when the case was filed now watched from the sidelines, too afraid to speak. Others simply disappeared. The chair creaked as he leaned back, arms folded. Was it worth it? He asked himself that for the first time. Not out of weakness, but weariness. The kind that settles into your bones when truth seems powerless against spectacle. His mind drifted not to courtrooms or campaigns, but to a memory. He was 8 years old, standing beside his mother in a dry field outside Dory. She was humming a song as she plucked weeds from between the cassava roots. He remembered the smell of sun-warmed dust, the way her hands moved with both tenderness and precision. A woman who had nothing but gave everything. She once told him, if your voice ever shakes, let it be because you're lifting others, not because you're afraid. He closed his eyes. Now he was carrying the voices of thousands, and tonight that weight felt heavier than ever. Downstairs, the legal team had left hours ago. Elise had offered to stay, but he insisted she go home. She needed rest more than he needed company, or maybe he couldn't bear for her to see him like this. Not tonight. Then came the news passed to him by his chief advisor, left as a printed memo on the table beside a half-drunk cup of tea. Senator J.D. Vance to file countersuit, claim defamation, political interference, economic sabotage. Damages sought $125 million. The words barely registered. Of course Vance would strike back. That was his way offense, masked as defense. Noise in place of accountability. But this it felt like losing, not because of legalities, but because the world seemed to be asking him to fight a battle that no longer cared about right and wrong, only who had more volume, more lawyers, more airtime. He rested his head against the cool glass of the window. Across the street, a woman walked her dog. 2 kids rode scooters. Life oblivious moved on. He whispered almost inaudibly, "What if the truth isn't enough?" No one answered. No applause, no echo. Just the soft wind tapping against the glass and the darkness beyond it. But somewhere deeper than doubt, buried beneath exhaustion and fear, something remained. Not defiance, not confidence. Just the smallest ember of refusal to be erased. The message came just before dawn. Elise's encrypted line pinged with a priority alert from an unknown sender using a congressional relay domain that hadn't been active in over a year. The subject line was a single word: regret. She almost ignored it. Spam filters had been wild since the smear campaign began, but something about the routing path made her forward it to Ibrahim. 10 minutes later, they were both in the townhouse conference room, hair uncombed, coffee untouched, watching a short text scroll across the secure laptop screen. I should have stopped him. I didn't. I have recordings. Meet in person. No staff. No press. FMR Sen MR. Mark Rutledge, Elise whispered. He chaired foreign appropriations before he retired. He and Vance overlapped 2 sessions. Ibrahim nodded slowly. Set it up. They met that night in an underground parking structure beneath a medical complex in Arlington, the kind of neutral ground chosen by people who either watch too many thrillers or know exactly how these things go. Rutledge arrived without security, wearing a windbreaker and a baseball cap that failed to disguise the posture of a man who had spent decades in power. "I'm not here to save you," he said before anyone spoke. "I'm here because I don't want this attached to my grandchildren's name when the truth finally blows open." He slid a slim, unlabeled flash drive across the hood of a parked sedan. "Boardroom fundraisers," he said. "Closed-door donor briefings. Dominion Ridge and affiliated PAC bundlers." Vance didn't just know he sold it. He called Africa a gold mine with no owners. His words, not mine. Elise's breath caught. You recorded a sitting Senator. Rutledge gave a tired half shrug. Donors record everything. Lawyers insist. I kept copies. Habit. Back at the townhouse, their digital forensics consultant authenticated the file headers. Timestamps matched known donor events. Ambient chatter cross-referenced with guest manifests. The voice print, 98% confidence. J.D. Vance. They played the key clip 3 times. Look, if we don't secure those tracks in the Sahel, the Chinese will. Those villages, they're unregistered. It's a gold mine with no owners. We help the right players clear it, we all win. Fast approvals. Quiet partners. Don't overthink it. Laughter followed. Glasses clinked. Ibrahim closed his eyes. He could see Farimo, Kaole, Zur Kudugu, villages with names, songs, graves reduced to unregistered. Elise leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. This changes discovery. This changes jury perception. This changes everything. Within 24 hours, the audio redacted, verified, entered, under seal, formed the backbone of an emergency evidentiary motion. Word leaked as intended that new recordings tied Vance directly to resource clearance language. Cable panels lit up. Even outlets that had mocked the case now used phrases like potentially explosive. Conservative commentators scrambled to frame the quote as taken out of context, but the damage was done. Viewers had heard the contempt in his tone. Reporters camped outside Vance's office. Staffers dodged microphones. Pollsters tracked a sudden dip in suburban approval. Faith leaders began issuing statements. The smear campaign didn't stop, but it no longer had the room to breathe. Late that night, Ibrahim stood with Rutledge in the townhouse entryway as the former senator prepared to leave. Why now? Ibrahim asked. Rutledge took a long breath. Because I sat in too many rooms where people like me talked about land like yours as if no one lived on it. You made it personal. It always was. He left without shaking hands. Above them, D.C. Sirens wailed in the distance, and for the first time in weeks, the night felt less like an ending and more like ignition. The audio hit the internet at 8:03 a.m. Eastern Time. Within the first 5 minutes, it had been reposted over 1,000 times. By noon, it was playing on every major network, every smartphone, every public screen, from New York to Nairobi. And it was all the same clip. It's a gold mine with no owners. The voice was unmistakable, calm, calculated. J.D. Vance, speaking to donors behind closed doors, joking about unregistered villages in West Africa, as though they were poker chips. His words didn't just sound cold, they sounded owned, as if he had long forgotten there were people attached to that land. The backlash came in waves. First, the media pivoted. Outlets that once framed Ibrahim as a military agitator now ran headlines like, "Expose J.D. Vance's private words on Africa spark, global outrage from hillbilly elegy to global scandal, lawmakers distance themselves." Amid explosive leak, progressive anchors called it imperialism. Moderates called it inexcusable. Even certain conservative commentators, usually loyal to the core, admitted, this one's bad. Then came the silence, not from the public, but from Vance himself. He canceled his scheduled appearance at a veterans fundraiser in Ohio, then a policy forum in Florida, then a podcast interview with a major political figure. Reporters camped outside his D.C. apartment, but no one answered the door. The man who once seemed addicted to cameras was now hiding from their lens. Inside his campaign, chaos reigned. 2 senior aides resigned within 24 hours. By the end of the week, nearly half his staff had walked. One leaked a resignation letter that read, "I didn't sign up to be part of something this morally bankrupt." Corporate sponsors followed. Dominion Ridge officially cut ties. PSEs quietly pulled funding. A tech CEO who had previously maxed out donations to Vance issued a press release. "We were deceived. We do not stand by those statements or the mindset behind them." Even the political elite began stepping back. A bipartisan ethics committee launched a formal review. Democratic senators demanded criminal inquiry into resource corruption abroad. And perhaps most telling, a quiet but unmistakable shift among moderate Republicans. They stopped defending him. No party email chains. No press releases of solidarity. Just silence. And in Washington, silence is never neutral. It's lethal. On Capitol Hill, Ibrahim walked through a hallway, normally buzzing with cameras, and heard only footsteps. The energy had changed. Whispers followed him now, not as suspicion, but as acknowledgement. At the townhouse, Elise monitored the feed's eyes scanning the metrics. 34 million views, she said, and counting. Ibrahim didn't respond. He sat at the same desk where weeks earlier he had read hate mail threats and hollow apologies. Now the tide had shifted. The truth had caught up. But instead of smiling, he looked almost mournful. "He'll disappear," Ibrahim said, "and in a few years they'll try to rewrite the memory. Say he was misunderstood. Say it was a one-time lapse. They always do." Elise nodded. "But the audio will live. And so will the names," he said quietly, "of every village he tried to erase." Outside, protesters no longer chanted in desperation, they sang. Their voices didn't beg. They declared. Signs read, not just justice for Africa, but no more shadows and land has memory. J.D. Vance hadn't just lost a case. He had lost the illusion. The courtroom was packed. Journalists crammed shoulder to shoulder along the gallery benches, their pens poised, their cameras held at chest level like weapons. The world outside had already chosen sides, but here in this wood-paneled chamber, it was down to 12 strangers and the weight of evidence they could no longer ignore. J.D. Vance sat motionless, jaw-set, eyes forward, wearing the same Navy suit from day one. Whatever defiance he once wore like armor had dulled into calculation. No smirk, no self-righteous shrug, only silence. Ibrahim sat 3 rows behind his legal team. He didn't need to be up front. He wasn't there for spectacle. He was there for the words. The judge returned. Then the jury. The foreperson, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s, with a nervous crease between her brows, stood paper in hand. In the matter of financial misconduct and authorization of unethical foreign contracts, the jury finds the defendant, James David Vance, guilty on all counts. The words cracked through the air like a lightning strike, a ripple of gasps. A chair scraped the floor. J.D.'s lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but Vance didn't react. He just blinked, slowly. The judge adjusted his glasses, then continued. Given the evidence submitted and the gravity of the misconduct, this court awards the plaintiff, President Ibrahim Traoré, and the nation of Burkina Faso $100 million in compensatory damages. The room did not erupt. It exhaled. A tension older than this case, older than the court itself, finally released. Outside, news vans flashed, breaking banners. Within seconds, J.D. Vance found guilty. $100 million verdict, justice across continents. Ibrahim Traoré from general to giant slayer. At the press conference later that evening, microphones flooded Ibrahim's path like a tide. He stood still, calm, hands clasped before him. Elise stood just behind him, unreadable but steady. "I did not bring this case for vengeance," Ibrahim said into the wall of cameras. "I brought it because silence over time becomes complicity. We have been silent for too long." He paused, letting the silence work for him now. $100 million may sound like justice, but no amount of money will return the land, the graves, the history erased. And so effective immediately, $50 million will be transferred into an international restoration fund overseen by independent partners to rebuild the displaced communities that Vance's contracts helped destroy. Gasps, clicks, a rare standing ovation from members of the press. Ibrahim didn't bow, didn't raise a fist. He simply nodded. As night fell over, Washington, D.C., J.D. Vance left the courthouse through a side door, avoiding the cameras. No staff followed. No statements were issued. His fall was not theatrical. It was quiet, almost private. But that silence spoke louder than anything he had ever shouted. Somewhere in West Africa, in a clearing where bulldozers once roared, an elder woman placed a new stone atop an old grave. Around her, children ran between the trees. The air was not healed, but it was breathing again. Justice hadn't been perfect. It never was. But for the first time in a long time, it had been visible and remembered. The room was quiet, not the silence of disinterest, but the reverent hush before a storm of meaning. Rows of faces, young and old, academic robes and military jackets, journalists and activists, all sat motionless in the black box auditorium. The venue was intimate, but the eyes of the world watched through lenses and live streams. The banner above read, "Beyond Borders, Global Justice in the 21st Century." At center stage stood Ibrahim Traoré, not in a presidential suit, but a simple tailored jacket over a traditional West African tunic. His hands were empty. No notes, no teleprompter. Just his voice and the weight of history behind it. He paused before speaking, letting his eyes meet the front row. Then the middle. Then the balcony. When I was a boy, he began, I thought justice came in uniforms. That power always wore medals, and that silence meant safety. A soft chuckle echoed. Recognition. Pain. I was wrong. Power wears many faces. And silence, my friends. Silence often means permission. He stepped forward, his voice steady. Let me ask you something. When a foreign company levels a village for minerals, who speaks for the grandmother left with no land to bury her dead? When a senator jokes about gold mines with no owners, who reminds him that land was not empty? It was erased. Gasps, then stillness. He went on, justice is not a Western invention. It is not born in marble courts or written only in English. Justice has always existed in drum circles and desert councils, in stories told by firelight, and in the eyes of the young when they say, this is not right. Camera lights blinked. Social media posts exploded. I do not stand here as a man who won. I stand here as one who refused to lose quietly. And that more than verdicts, more than headlines, is what this generation must learn. You may not always win, but never mistake silence for peace. The room held its breath. I sued a senator, yes, but I also sued a system, a legacy, a belief that some voices are disposable, some lives negotiable, and some lands ownerless. A beat. He looked out and said with calm force, justice has no nationality. That line would echo across timelines and tongues. Within 24 hours, the speech had been clipped, subtitled, and shared across continents. Justice has no nationality trended in 73 countries. In Ghana, students projected the speech onto campus walls. In Brazil, a favela school played it before class. At the University of Oxford, it was screened in a law and decolonization seminar. TED Talks requested an official version. The UN invited Ibrahim to its Human Rights Assembly. Harvard, Stanford, and the London School of Economics extended speaking invitations. He accepted only one. Instead, he flew to a newly rebuilt village in northern Burkina Faso where no microphones waited. Only villagers, elders, and the wind. He helped plant a baobab sapling where a community well once stood. Around it, children gathered. He handed them notebooks, not contracts, stories, not speeches. You are not the future, he told them quietly. You are the present, and the world is listening now. From lawsuit to legend, Ibrahim had become something few leaders ever do, not just a headline, not just a symbol, but a mirror. One that forced the world to ask itself, if justice has no borders, then why do we? Ibrahim returns to Burkina Faso, not to applause from dignitaries, but to the laughter of children and the warmth of villagers. One community once erased by mining deals has been rebuilt using part of the settlement fund. Schools are standing, clean water flows and murals of culture have reappeared on once bare walls. As he walks the dusty road, children chant his name, not out of worship but gratitude. He smiles humbly, reminding them, I didn't win this for me. I just refused to lose for you. He kneels to plant a baobab sapling in the village center. His voice is calm but resonant. This tree doesn't belong to me. It's yours. Guard it like you would your future. In that moment, legacy shifts from courtroom drama to lived experience. Back in the U.S., the aftershocks of the trial shake the Capitol. A bipartisan group drafts the International Corporate Accountability Bill, requiring U.S. firms operating abroad to disclose all contracts involving land resources and labor. The bill, once unthinkable, finds surprising support across parties. Meanwhile, Dominion Ridge Mining Co. collapses. Shareholders flee. Investigations mount. Former executives face questioning by international regulators. Other corporations begin proactively auditing their own overseas operations, fearing similar exposure. NGOs across Africa, Asia, and Latin America seize the moment. They call for global frameworks that hold Western firms accountable. For the first time in decades, the conversation shifts from charity for the global South to accountability to it. Students rally, journalists dig deeper. The narrative is no longer, how can we help? It becomes, why did we look away for so long? Months later, Elise Ford, now recognized globally for her fiery court presence, publishes a memoir titled The Black Dossier. Part courtroom chronicle, part political awakening, the book details the inner workings of the case and the years of exploitation it exposed. It skyrockets to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. Media houses adapt the story into a docuseries. One of them, aired on PBS, makes its way into schools. Final scene: a humble classroom in rural Alabama. The lights are off, a projector flickers to life. The room is full of black students watching a scene where Ibrahim testifies in court. One boy, no older than 10, leans forward, eyes wide. He whispers to himself, barely audible, "One day I'll do that too." The legacy has taken root not in headlines, but in hearts. This story wasn't just about a lawsuit. It was about a voice once dismissed rising to confront a system that had grown comfortable in silence. Ibrahim Traoré's courage reminds us that justice isn't a luxury for the powerful, but a right for the unheard. Through resilience, truth, and integrity, he turned pain into purpose and sparked a global reckoning. What began as a courtroom drama became something far greater, a mirror for all of us to ask, not just who holds power, but how they use it. The fight against injustice doesn't always require grand titles. Sometimes it begins with someone simply saying, "Enough." Change doesn't come overnight, but it begins when we decide to stop looking away. And you watching this, what would you do if the truth knocked on your door? Would you speak up even when it's inconvenient? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.